Okay, so Khalid, he has been, he's one of them pop singers that really don't be sharing his personal life.
Good for him.
Okay, so nobody really knows about him, what he's into, what the relationships all look like. Well, last week, a man came out and essentially drug his name through there and then ousted Khalid.
I did see this. Yeah.
Right. So Khalid, turns out he
came out of the closet.
He didn't get came. He got thrown out of the closet.
I know, but he officially came out because of this announcement.
Yep. And one thing that I really appreciated about it, I really liked his approach to it. He was like, look, guys, I got outed, and the world keeps going. Obviously, it was not something he was hoping to share. And then people were like, how come you didn't share this before? How come you're keeping it a secret?
Right.
Khalid?
Of course they were.
And his response was, I wasn't keeping it a secret. It's just none of your business.
Right.
And I was like, my man.
Well, because also, like, I think that there are a lot of people that don't want the media or anyone else to know who they're dating, who they're with, what their relationships look like, male or female, straight or gay. They don't care. They just don't want you to be a part of it. And there are a lot of reasons for that. I can even tell you that just from our platform, like, people have so many horrible opinions about who a stranger that they've never met is married to.